Hi class. In this lecture, we're going to talk about William Faulkner's story, A Rose for Emily. And I'll walk you through what happens in this story because it is a little difficult to read. It was written in 1930, and there's some of the language and the time period, the historical context, all of this plays a role in the narrative. And it can be a little difficult to read and understand the first time just because it jumps around in terms of chronology. So it's not a linear, it's not very easy to follow in terms of its timeline. It does jump and back and forth between time, and this narrative structure is going to be really also thematically important to understand the character of Miss Emily Grierson because she remains kind of sort of stuck in time. And this will be one of the sort of characteristics or key features of her character will be the fact that she doesn't really understand or allow time to pass. She remains kind of stuck in an older, more traditional way, a way of being. So as she's described in the introduction to my version of the story, so it describes Miss Emily. The story's enduring appeal lies in the enigma that is Miss Emily, as she denies the passage of time and clings to the traditions of the Old South, as embodied by the late Colonel Sartoris and his generation. So Miss Emily is this kind of throwback to a time gone by, a time that's past. Um, and she sort of remains stuck, but the rest of society is moving forward. So she becomes a sort of representation, almost a symbol of the traditional old Southern ways of the United States. Um, and we'll talk a little bit more about that kind of culture and the traditions and the even the political, social divisions that the Old South represent, and that her family and herself become sort of symbols of. But we see her stuck in regards to moving forward in time, in her mind at least. So the setting of the story becomes a kind of important part of the narrative. So when we think about setting, it's not just the location, the place. You can also think about the time period, the culture in which this story is taking place. So what was going on at the time and place, in this case, the Old South, during the time that these characters were alive. Um, so setting often sort of describes not just the physical location and the features in the physical environment, but it also sort of embrace or sort of encompasses larger historical context, the political or social climate or environment in which these characters are sort of um, part of. And so we have the Old South as our physical environment and setting in the story. So if you know anything about the Old South, the American South, you know it is a location, a place that there was a lot of sort of social struggles, a lot of strife between, in terms of racial segregation. And the Old South had this kind of colonial um, hierarchy where you had a very sort of rigid divide between class systems, so a class division. And Emily's family, Miss Emily's family, the Griersons, were very well off at during the sort of Civil War era. So her family, her father would have made his money on this plantation, and he would have had slaves. He was basically a slave owner, and she was this young socialite, kind of debutante, the daughter of a very wealthy man, and they lived in this very illustrious mansion. Um, and it's described now in its kind of derelict state. It's now, at the very first paragraph, we learn that this is, Emily has died at this point. Time has gone by. Her house that she had lived in and grown up in, and it's in, disrepair. It's falling apart. It's an eyesore. But at one time, it was, a beautiful, almost like a mansion. So the house will become a symbolic feature of this decline and decay that Miss Emily experiences, her family experiences, and all the old sort of traditions of the Old South start to fall apart, and it's the passage of time. So if you think about the Old South, the ways, the culture that Emily and her father and Colonel Sartoris represent, it is uh, a more racist society, and that's reflected in some of the language that's used in the story. Um, there's also, very strict class systems. Emily's family would be the aristocratic class. So she was from a very wealthy, well-to-do family. They had a lot of power and status in society, and people looked up to them. She was a bit, almost on a pedestal. People admired her, looked to her, wanted to see what she would do. They would gossip about her, but she was a very well-to-do young lady from a wealthy family. But there was this moment of decline. We know there is decline, and things have fallen apart for that way of life. So with the Civil War, the establishment of, freedom for slaves, men like Mr. Grierson, Emily's father, would have lost a lot of their wealth and status. Um, so we're kind of stuck in this moment for Emily where it is post-Civil War society, but there's not yet civil rights. So she's kind of in this in-between place in time and culture where there's still racism, there's still classes, like a class system of, higher class and lower class, blue collar and northern and southerners. Um, but their society is moving forward, they're progressing, they're going to get more and more, um, more equality, less traditional as time goes on. But she kind of gets stuck in this moment of time when her father will die and leave her a young lady who is pretty much, destitute. Her father lost a lot of his money, and their family is no longer the wealthy sort of socialites of Jefferson, Mississippi. So when slavery was abolished, her father and their way of life would have also ended. So they would have been a very well-to-do family, and then they would have lost their money. So that decline of their money and status will become very important to Emily's adult life, and how she has to sort of make do with what she's given, the cards she's been dealt, once her father's presence is no longer in her life. But it's important to keep in mind the sort of social, historical context of race and class in the Old South to understand kind of the dynamics, the social dynamics that Emily is kind of locked into, and the rest of Jefferson are also have a kind of mindset related to that specific time and place. Okay, so if we think about Miss Emily, she could be referred to as a kind of proper Southern belle. So if you're familiar with a Southern belle, or a young lady, like a socialite, I guess we would call them nowadays, but a traditional proper Southern belle would be a young woman who holds a certain status, a certain amount of prestige, a certain class, uh, and she would have been, a more aristocratic class. So her family would have had wealth, and they would have had a lot of power in Jefferson. But there's also, to go along with that, there's a lot of sort of rules and restrictions that a young woman, a proper woman of this class in society, she'd have a lot of restrictions placed on her. So there is this idea of noblesse oblige, and the story mentions that Emily is kind of afflicted by this sense of it literally translates to the obligations of nobility. So if you're an aristocrat, you're part of sort of the nobility of society. You're the, higher up on the sort of social hierarchy. But there's obligations to go along with that. So there's a lot of rules and restrictions that are in place that define sort of gender propriety, like the proper etiquette for a young lady at this time and place in history. So some rules or expectations that a proper young lady might be sort of experienced during this period. So we can imagine this is sort of late 1800s when Emily was, a proper young Southern belle, a young woman. So she would have been restricted in terms of her dating. So this is one of the main sort of afflictions or constraints that she experiences. And we learn about how her father was very controlling of her, her whole courtship phase. So she would have been a young woman, 16, 17, and you kind of have this, it's almost like the, coming out where you become, dateable. It's like the debutante kind of ball, where you become, a young lady who's looking for a suitor, a suitable man who will, maybe one of many suitors that you might have, who, maybe wants to marry you or court you and then fall in love, get married, that kind of thing. So that's if it's a successful courtship, it ends in marriage. But unfortunately for Emily, she struggles as a young lady because her father is very strict and controlling.